Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, voting goes smoothly in Sierra Leone as voters turn out to choose who will take over from President Ernest Bai Koroma and hopefully spearhead an economic turnaround for the country. Also, international rights investigators say South Sudan's president and his inner circle are using the state-run oil company as a piggy bank and creaming off money to fund the country's civil war. We hear more from the author of the report from Global Witness. And many rural Liberians are hoping that new President George Weah will pass a bill to shore up their ownership rights to land many have worked and lived on for generations. But first, voting went smoothly in Sierra Leone on Wednesday, as millions of people turned out for a general election that will deliver a successor to President Ernest Bai Koroma. He's stepping down after serving his maximum 2 terms as leader. Many Sierra Leoneans are hoping that who comes next can do more to turn the country's economy around.
There was not a car in sight on the usually busy commercial street in the capital, Freetown. Military personnel were also deployed to enforce the ban on vehicles. Only taxis and accredited cars were allowed on the roads during election day. Many headed to the polls on foot. Mohammed walked more than 13 kilometers to vote.
We are expecting development in our country because there are some youth who are without work. They are in the country without work. So we need more investors to come into our country, to invest in our country, so the youth will have more employment, so the country will go in a faster space.
Across town, queues snake around most polling stations. Many voters say they turned up before dawn to secure their place in line. The long wait in the blazing sun took its toll and left some a little hot under the collar. But overall, voting went smoothly.
I was here at around 4 a.m. in the morning hours, seeing people crowding. So I thought that there will be a chaos. But due to the calming manner of the people, they try to understand that the voting process is going on smoothly.
Inside, it's time to choose. An estimated 3 million registered voters are electing a new president, legislators and councillors. General elections in a country still feeling the effects of a deadly Ebola epidemic and desperate to reverse youth unemployment figures, which stand at 70%. There's an air of expectation in this bus, transporting voters home. High expectations for their future president.
We want that person that will stand for us, that will make us proud, that will tell people all over the world that we are Sierra Leoneans and we have talent, and we are bold. We have talent, we are smart, we are intelligent. So we want change. We want change in our nation. That's all we want.
Results are expected to start trickling in from Friday.
Well, that report was sent to us by Liane G. Bossam-Pierre, who was in Freetown for us on Wednesday. She joins us now with more on what she has been following. Liane, so now it's just the wait for the results ahead. There are 16 candidates in the running. Tell us more about the platforms of the main contenders in the race.
The line cut.
Liane, can you hear us? Well, that is a shame. We've got some technical difficulties there with getting through to Liane. Hopefully she will be able to join us a little later on in the bulletin. But for the moment, let's move on. Hundreds of people turned out in Ouagadougou on Wednesday for the funerals of the 8 soldiers killed in last week's twin terror attacks in the Burkina capital. Over 60 troops and 24 civilians were also injured in assaults on army headquarters and the French embassy last Friday. Mali-based al-Qaeda-linked group JNIM claimed responsibility for the raids. Authorities say that 8 people, including 2 soldiers, have been arrested in connection to the attacks. Cape Town's pushed back the estimated date for the turning off of piped water in the city in response to the worst drought the region's seen in over a century. Dubbed Day Zero, it had been expected to fall around July the 8th. But after a massive drive to save water, it's reckoned that with no rainfall, the taps will run dry on August 27th. That falls within the normal rainfall period, and the hope is that could mean the cut-off could be avoided completely in 2018. Well, we've got Leanne back, Leanne de Bossom-Pierre, who is in Freetown following the Sierra Leone's general election, our top story of the day. Leanne, we are now waiting for the results of that election to find a new president for the country. 16 candidates in the running. Tell us more about what they've been campaigning on and who they are, who the main contenders are.
Well, Georgia, as you mentioned, it is an unprecedented number of candidates coming from a country that's had a two-party race since independence from Britain in 1961. The incumbent president handpicked his successor, who is Samura Kamara. He's a former foreign minister who resigned in October last year to focus on the race to the presidency. He's spoken out against corruption, but how serious can voters take him if he's been in that government that he's saying has been corrupt for so many years? He's got a very strong party affiliation, and that may stand against him when people look at him as a contender, because if he is calling them corrupt, what does that say about him? His official opposition, which is the Sierra Leone People's Party, they've come out quite strongly with their candidate Julius Madubia, who's a retired general, calling the current government corrupt. They've also spoken out against the government's strong relations with the Chinese, saying all these infrastructure projects are all fine and well, but what does that actually mean for jobs for local people? Saying that Chinese, they come in with all their own resources, all their own people, their own cooks, their own cleaners, all their own laborers as well. So that doesn't really mean much for local residents. Of course, when you have a youth unemployment rate of 70%, unemployment is a huge issue. So in comes the third contender, a big contender rather, in this race, who is Kande Yumkala. He's a former UN diplomat. He has a lot of experience in the resource industry, especially with developing countries. He's focused his campaign on the youth, and he's used social media. He's engaged with them on multiple platforms. And even though he's only had his party formation for less than 6 months, they're calling him the Macron of Sierra Leone.
Thanks very much. Leanne de Bossom-Pierre there for us in Freetown. Well, rights investigators say that South Sudan state oil company is being used by the inner circle of President Salva Kiir to fund the country's civil war. Global Witness released a report this week alleging that Nile Petroleum, or NilePet, is supplying millions of dollars in revenue to South Sudanese politicians, officials, and even government-aligned militia accused of rights abuses during the country's 4 years of conflict. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Michael Gibb from Global Witness. He helped compose that report. Michael, thanks for joining us. Now, what made you believe that South Sudanese oil has become a key driver in the country's civil war?
Thanks for having me. South Sudan is one of the most oil-dependent countries in the world, and as such, its conflict is likely one of the most oil-dependent in the world as well. Oil has provided an incentive to the fighting parties, who might hope that they'll be able to loot that prize should they be able to seize central power. But more importantly, it's also offered a means of paying for the expenditure of war, of paying for troops and weapons, and also in some cases paying civilian armed militia who have fought both on the side of the government and the opposition. And what our report reveals is one of the mechanisms by which oil funds have been diverted away from the people and treasury of South Sudan and into the conflict. And it's done so through the capture of the state-owned oil company NilePet. Now, NilePet was set up to make sure that the interests of the South Sudanese people were represented in the country's oil industry. But regrettably, what we've seen happen is that a small number of elites around the president, as well as the head of the National Security Services that sits on the company's board, have been able to take control of the company. And with this control, they've been able to divert large sums of money away from the treasury and people of South Sudan and into the conflicts, but with much less oversight and scrutiny than would ordinarily be the case. NilePet's a private company, and as such, it isn't subject to the same regulatory oversight as, say, a government ministry. And this has meant that they've been able to shield some of these transactions from international and domestic eyes.
So Michael, what do you want to see happen? Can these fears affect the way that international companies work with Nile Pet?
Absolutely. I think it's tempting to think that maybe this is a South Sudanese problem. But, you can't pay troops with oil. South Sudan is completely dependent on its ability to sell oil. And every seller has a buyer. And many of those buyers are right here in Europe. They're large international oil companies and commodity traders. And what we're calling on those companies to do is really use their influence and their leverage to make sure that any business that's done in South Sudan is responsible. That means making sure it's transparent so that everyone has a good idea of how much money has been raised and can make sure it's being spent appropriately and in the interest of the people. And second, making sure that any business is done in accordance with South Sudanese laws, including making sure that all payments are made into the right accounts.
Michael?
This isn't about telling South Sudan.
Michael Gibb, thank you very much for joining us. Michael Gibb there from Global Witness.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks for having us. Many rural communities in Liberia are hoping that new President George Weah will move forward with legislation that could strengthen their right to land on which they may have lived and worked for generations. Many ownership disputes are between commercial investors giving equity by the state with little consultation with people living on the land in question.
In this field in northwest Liberia, young palm oil trees extend as far as the eye can see, in place of what inhabitants of the neighbouring village were hoping would be a clinic or a school. The trees belong to the Malaysian company Siem Darby, one of 4 big palm oil producers operating in the West African country.
We all came here and told them, well, this piece of land we wanted for development. So we're begging people to leave this land for us for development. And how they left the piece of land. While we were negotiating what kind of development should come on the land, when we got ready, they said we should write.
In Liberia, the vast majority of land belongs by default to the state, which can grant companies concessions to exploit its resources. Taxes from palm, iron and rubber farms are a lifeline for the small, impoverished nation as it slowly recovers from 14 years of civil war. While villagers say the opaque nature of the contracts signed in their absence means they have little knowledge of what has been agreed, community leaders insist that the agreements are all above board.
What we've done, that was done at the highest level, through our representatives and the senators.
A draft law aimed at regulating these practices has been in the pipeline for 4 years. If adopted, it would constitute the first step towards resolving a decades-old conflict over land ownership that dates back to the late 19th century when Liberia was founded.
These communities that have known to themselves over time that they own the land, but in actuality, under the legal framework, the land is not really theirs. They're basically squatting on the land. So what this land rights bill seeks to do is to give these real owners the land that they own.
During former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's 12 years in power, several multi-decade concession agreements were renewed or changed hands, throwing new scrutiny on land deals. The government of new President George Weah is expected to reconsider the land rights bill, which could impact the lives of millions of Liberians.
We'll be back with more in 45 minutes. Take care.